celestial divinatory schemes and the fourth tablet of Summa Sin Ina Tamaritsu. So I don't know, he's laughing. I don't know if you're going to talk about that.
Just rolls off the tongue.
But he's going to talk to us today about by the rivers of Babylon, biblical Israel in and against ancient Mesopotamia.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Ron. I appreciate the introduction there. Just so everybody knows, I have the source sheet. I posted a link to the source sheet in the chat, so please take a look there. I'm also going to be sharing my screen with you, and then we'll also be looking at it together. We're not going to be getting into some of the divinatory stuff that Ron was talking about. We might kind of brush on it a little bit in our third session. But the real goal of these sessions is to look at the interactions between ancient Iraq, which we're going to call by a number of different names, right? One is going to be Mesopotamia, which is going to kind of be the whole thing. And one's going to be Assyria, and the last is going to be Babylonia. And so we're going to look at the interactions between ancient Iraq, Assyria, Babylonia, Mesopotamia, and modern day Israel. So the ancient kingdoms of Judah and Israel specifically. All right, and so that's really going to be the focus of these three meetings. This first meeting is really going to focus on kind of higher level political interactions. We're going to be looking at a lot of sources that were written by political elites, potentially for consumption by other political elites, right? This is not going to be kind of the normal run of the mill, people on the street. We're going to be looking at some of that material during the second session and potentially during the third session. But so that's just a little bit of an introduction. And then let's just start here. Can everybody see my screen here? Okay, great. So this is kind of just a map to orient us, if you will, if you'll excuse the pun. And what this is really going to show us, the darker green is territory that Assyria controlled by the middle of the 9th century BCE. The lighter green is territory Assyria controlled during the early 600s BCE. As you can see, they control basically the entire Middle East all the way through Egypt. And what we're really going to be specifically focusing on is how kind of these big green colored blobs interact with this really small area over here. Right? So this yellow of Judah, and then further north, it's not even on the map highlighted, but this is really the kingdom of Israel, right? With Samaria as its capital, okay? So this is really gonna be the focus. And it's important to note that this whole series of talks, I guess, right? I don't wanna call it a lecture. It's gonna be hugely interactive, right? This is only going to work if everybody's in this together. So I would encourage you to unmute. I'm going to be asking a lot of questions, volunteers for reading, things like that. And so please, if the spirit moves you, feel free to volunteer, okay? All right. So we're going to move on to our first kind of written source here, okay? This is from Zephaniah. Does anybody want to read this source here, source number 2?
Or English?
Either way is fine.
And he will stretch out his arm against the north and destroy Assyria. He will make Nineveh a desolation, arid as the desert. In it flocks shall lie down, every species of beast, while jackals and owls roost on its capitals. The great owl hoots in the window, and the raven croaks on the threshold, for he has stripped its cedarwood bare. Is this the happy city that dwelt secure, that though in my heart, the thought in her heart, I am, and there is none but me? Alas, she has become a waste, a lair of wild beasts. Everyone who passes by her hisses and gestures with his hand.
Perfect. Thank you so much. That also just kind of brings me to another housekeeping note. Please, before you respond, because I can only see a few people, before you respond, please just say your name before you start speaking or reading, so that everybody can kind of get to know each other a little bit here. But so that source that we just read from Zephaniah, right? What would you say is really kind of the key focus here, right? What's going on here? If you had to sum this up in 3 words, 4 words, really, what would you say this is talking about? I guess, right, to maybe reframe the question a little bit.
The destruction of Assyria.
Good, right? The destruction of Assyria, and specifically the destruction of Assyria by somebody who is sad to see Assyria destroyed, or someone who is kind of excited that it's happening.
Who's happy that it's happening.
Absolutely, right? This is, right, Zephaniah is a prophet who's prophesying from 640 to 620 during his lifetime. Assyria, which was kind of this massive empire that controlled Israel earlier, really controlled parts of Judah during different times. It came to an end, and as a kind of a colony, right, of Assyria, and as kind of part of someone who is part of that political elite of a colonized place, right, Zephaniah is definitely not sad that it's happening, right? And we could have different sources within the Hebrew Bible that would have reflected that as well. But I think that this probably does it the best. I just want to kind of have you keep this in mind as we move forward, to really kind of think about what could have happened between Assyria and Israel on the one hand and Judah on the other that would have caused someone to be kind of, right, to be an excited onlooker as Assyria is destroyed. Okay, so just kind of something to keep in the back of our heads here. Okay, we are now going to move on to our first historical source, if you will. This is coming from the Book of Kings, and we're going to focus on Ahab, or Achav in Hebrew. Who would like to read source 3?
And I could read. It's Ron.
Go for it, Ron.
Ahab, the son of Omri, became king over Israel in the 38th year of King Asa of Judah. And Ahab, son of Omri, reigned over Israel and Samaria for 22 years. Ahab, son of Omri, did what was displeasing to the Lord more than all who preceded him. Not content to follow the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, he took as wife Jezebel, daughter of King Ethbaal of the Phoenicians, and he went and served Baal and worshipped him. He erected an altar to Baal in the temple of Baal, which he built in Samaria. Ahab also made a sacred post. Ahab did more to vex the Lord, the God of Israel, than all the kings of Israel who preceded him.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Ron. All right, once again, right, if we were to kind of sum this up in a couple of words, what's going on here? What's this little snippet that we just read from the Book of Kings?
Ahab was bad and a sinner.
Good, right? So Ahab was bad and a sinner, right? Ahab is this someone who becomes king over Israel. This is one of those things that the Book of Kings does over and over when somebody takes the throne, and it kind of gives a nice little compact summary of their reign. And so in the case of Ahab, right, the summary is basically Ahab took the throne. This is how long he reigned for, yada, yada. He did terrible things, right? He not only kind of followed in the sins of Jeroboam, he also heaped up all these other sins. And let me tell you about the sins that Ahab did, right? So from this picture, Ahab is a pretty bad dude, right? For lack of a better term. Looking at this source, would you say that this source is an unbiased picture of who Ahab was as a ruler?
Of course not.
Of course not, right? This is a very clearly biased picture. And so that's something that we have to keep in mind as we're really reading through all of these sources. The idea of history as kind of a third-party, unbiased picture of what actually happened. A lot of people would say doesn't exist nowadays, but it certainly didn't exist when this was written more than 2,500 years ago, right? It's a very complicated picture where you have historical fact intermixed with the comments of people who felt like what somebody was doing was wrong, or felt like what somebody was doing was right. But it's important to note that what we're getting is we're getting the picture of a small group of individuals, right? It might be representative of the larger population and what they thought. It might not be, right? And especially in the case of the Book of Kings, we have a source that was written by elites, like I said, for elites. And so it's important to kind of keep that in mind, right? Who's writing this, who's consuming this? All right, so we have a biased picture of Achav here. What are some of the biases? Just kind of what's the main bias that seems to stick out here? What is the author really concerned with about Ahab?
He's engaged in idol worship.
Right.
Right. So it's not necessarily Ahab was a just king who ruled over Israel well and who, dispensed justice and took care of the poor. It's he proliferated idol worship and made sure that kind of kept on going. And that's the reason why he's a bad king. Okay. Most people, if they've heard of Ahab, have heard of Jezebel, right? His queen, obviously. Jezebel as a name has kind of taken on a life of itself. They've probably heard of interactions between Ahab and Elijah. We're going to get a little bit more into Ahab to see what we can learn about Ahab if we look not only at the sources within the Book of Kings, but also some sources outside of the Book of Kings. All right. So we are going to we're going to start with kind of these sources 4 and 5. Who would like to read sources 4 and 5 for us?
Okay, I will, Jerry.
Thanks, Jerry.
Okay, King Ben-Hadad of Aram gathered his whole army. 32 kings accompanied him with horses and chariots. He advanced against Samaria, laid siege to it, and attacked it.
Great. And then source 4, I gave there as kind of like an introduction, just so everyone knows what's happening, right? Ben-Hadad, who is the king of Aram, king of Damascus, goes and besieges Samaria. And then, Ahab and Ben-Hadad end up fighting a number of different times. And this is kind of the result of that fight.
For 7 days, they were encamped opposite each other. On the 7th day, the battle was joined, and the Israelites struck down 100,000 Aramean foot soldiers in 1 day. Ben-Hadad said to him, I will give back the towns that my father took from your father, and you may set up bazaars for yourself in Damascus, as my father did in Samaria. And I, for my part, said Ahab, will let you go home under these terms. So he made a treaty with him and dismissed him.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Jerry. So looking at these two sources, sources 4 and 5 here, what kind of view of Ahab what kind of picture do they paint, right? What events are they emphasizing? And what do we learn about Ahab and his reign here in sources 4 and 5 that we didn't learn in the earlier source?
They were warriors fighting against each other to divide up the spoils. Of the everyday people, they didn't care about them. They were just dividing up the spoils. We'll win the battle. You take this, I'll take this, and then we'll be finished.
Absolutely, right? So on a high level, the regular kind of foot soldier or merchant doesn't really care about these engagements, right? But these are kind of battles between kings that will have an effect on everyday life, depending on kind of what happens, right? If your city gets besieged or whatever. But you're 100% right, Jerry. Good, right? So this is a focus on a battle. What else?
Also, that Ahab has won back territory that had been lost.
Great,
Right.
great, right? Absolutely, right? It's clear here, even though this is not the focus of this chapter or really the life of Ahab, but Ahab seems to be a pretty good warrior, right? It's not just that he inherits a big territory or, slowly but surely kind of loses it to other people. He seems to be a good warrior, and he's kind of getting back territory that was lost by his father. Great.
This is Norm Steinberg. So if he's also, if they took down 100,000 soldiers, and we're to believe that's the number, you would have to imagine that the Israelites had a very large standing army as well. And so as much as that Ahab could defend the Israelite kingdom from outside, he could certainly keep down the people or whoever else was against his internal policies as well as a very strong force.
Okay, right. Great point. Just one small note, but it doesn't really detract from your point at all. When we see numbers like this, right, 100,000 Aramean foot soldiers that he kills 100,000 in one day, always be suspect of large numbers in general. But what this does show us, and Norm is 100% right, it's not like the person who's writing this is just kind of making up these battles out of nowhere, right? A battle like this probably took place, and it seems like the Israelites won, right? It seems like the Israelites at least had the upper hand against Ben-Hadad, and it seems like Ahab had the wherewithal to not only, or the abilities to not only kind of put down a foreign power, but also, if need be, right, kind of staunch any sort of uprising that could come up within his own kingdom, right? So he seems to be a pretty strong king here. Absolutely.
This is Dan. What puzzles me is how the plot line is sort of counter to what we read before. I expected, in view of the first selection, that God would easily let the Israelites be defeated.
Great. Absolutely. Right. And I think that's one of my favorite part of the Book of Kings, that you have these kind of summaries of a king's reign. And for the most part, besides 2 Judahite kings, all the Judahite kings are basically, this guy was terrible, right? He did a terrible job and he led the Judeans astray and things like that. For Israelite kings, there might be a couple that aren't as bad as others, but basically all of them are, this king did a terrible job and kind of led people to idol worship. And so you're right? Based on that summary, our thought process is, okay, so then the things that the rest of the sources within Kings about Ahab are going to follow suit. But that's not really what happens at all, right? We see here a mixed picture, and I mean, from this one source, not even a mixed picture, just the picture of a leader who has exercised his military prowess, right? Has gained back territory from another leader, someone who had kind of not only gained back that territory, but also gained the ability to have his merchants set up shop in Damascus, right? This foreign country. And so that probably tells us that Ahab has the upper hand now in the relationship with Ben-Hadad, right? He allows Ben-Hadad to go home under these terms. Ben-Hadad does not say, I'll stop the siege under these terms, right? So Ahab very clearly has the upper hand after he's besieged by Ben-Hadad. Absolutely. Okay, so we're gonna pause there on that one because we have a lot to cover. Source 6, I think, once again, does some other things to potentially complicate our picture of Ahab. Who would like to read source 6 here?
I'll do it, Zach.
Great.
All right. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah the Tishbite, go down and confront King Ahab of Israel, who resides in Samaria. He is now in Naboth's vineyard. He has gone down there to take possession of it. Say to him, thus said the Lord, would you murder and take possession? Thus said the Lord, in the very place where the dogs lapped up Naboth's blood, the dogs will lap up your blood too. Ahab said to Elijah, so you have found me, my enemy. Yes, I have found you, he replied, because you have committed yourself to doing what is evil in the sight of the Lord. I will bring disaster upon you. I will make a clean sweep of you. I will cut off Israel from every male belonging to Ahab, bond and free. When Ahab heard these words, he rent his clothes and put sackcloth on his body. He fasted and lay in sackcloth and walked about subdued.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Norm. All right. What is the picture of Ahab that we get here?
Ruthless.
How does this kind of complement or complement some of the earlier sources, but also complicate our picture?
Ruthless.
Okay, right? On the one hand, at the beginning, ruthless, right? Someone who, all right, Naboth has a vineyard that is on the site that I want my capital, Samaria, to be, right? That's kind of the background of the story, that this guy Naboth has a vineyard. Ahab kind of tries to find ways to get it from him. None of them succeed. And so he just goes and he kills Naboth, right? And takes his vineyard and builds Samaria there, which is his capital. And so on the one hand, absolutely ruthless. What else?
When he's confronted, he's contrite. I mean, he's, does tshuva, right?
Absolutely, right? And that, I think that's the reason why I included this source here, because on the one hand, we have kind of this classic promise from Elijah, basically saying, because you did all these terrible things, because you killed Naboth in this way, your line, right, your royal line is going to be destroyed, right? And that's just what's going to happen. And Ahab, when he talks to Elijah, right, it's not, well, I don't believe you, right? And I obviously don't follow what God is saying, and so why would I listen to you? It's very much, right, it seems like he takes it to heart, right? And he's contrite. He kind of has this whole public display of mourning, right? Putting on sackcloth, fasting, right? Being subdued, all these other things. And obviously we can talk about, okay, is this real or is this not real? But what's really interesting to me is that he's at least showing outwardly that he's upset by that, right? That Elijah telling him that this is what's going to happen to you, that your dynasty is going to come to an end, it hits him hard, right? So he's to me a more interesting character than, on the one hand, a warrior who right, is victorious in his engagements with other kings. On the other hand, somebody who is not necessarily looked positively upon, for an understatement there, by the author of the Book of Kings. But then really kind of on the side is a human being. And so when he's confronted with, hey, you did something wrong and this is the result, it seems like his reaction is, oh, wow, that, I'm sorry, and I'm going to kind of act in the appropriate way of someone who's just heard this terrible news. Okay. We have one little line here, okay? After Ahab's death, Moab rebelled against Israel, okay? This line here just kind of throws in, and the reason why I included it here is because it's very clear that Israel controlled Moab, okay? If we go back to our trusty map over here, okay? Israel is over here, like I said. Moab is on the other side of the Jordan River and further south, okay? So it's closer to Judah than it is to Israel necessarily. But Ahab, right, not only fought with the king of Damascus, which we have up here, right, and ended up gaining concessions from him, getting territory back, but also seems to control some area down here to the southeast, right? So he has a pretty large territory. And once again, this is something that the author of the Book of Kings just kind of throws in, right? This isn't an important part at all. This is just, by the way, after Ahab dies, Moab rebels against Israel, okay? So this is our version of Ahab, basically, that we get from the Book of Kings. We're now going to turn to the royal inscription of Shalmaneser III, okay? Shalmaneser III, I'll take on kind of reading the Mesopotamian stuff because there's some brackets, there's some odd names and other things. I'm not going to subject anyone else to that. But Shalmaneser III is an important king in Assyrian history. This monument is probably written around 853 BCE, all right? And just going back to our map here so that we really get an idea, right? This darker green extent of the Assyrian Empire, this is 824. Shalmaneser III is an extremely important king who makes sure that the territory of Assyria, that kind of at its smallest, really encompasses this area, right? This kind of very, very small portion right here. He is an instrumental figure in enlarging that area so that it incorporates all of this here, okay? So just kind of a little bit of backstory there. So getting back to the Kerch monolith. So Shalmaneser III starts this inscription with, when Ashur, the great Lord, chose me in his steadfast heart, with his holy eyes, named me for the shepherdship of Assyria. He put in my grasp a strong weapon which fells the insubordinate. He crowned me with a lofty crown, and he sternly commanded me to exercise dominion over and to subdue all the lands insubmissive to Ashur. Moving on from the city of Argana, I approached the city of Karkar. I razed and destroyed it, and burned the city of Karkar, his royal city. An alliance had been formed between these 12 kings. 1,200 chariots, 1,200 cavalry, and 20,000 troops of Hadad Ezer of Damascus, 700 chariots, 700 cavalry, and 10,000 troops of Irhulenu, the Hamathite, 2,000 chariots and 10,000 troops of Ahab, the Israelite, 500 troops of Byblos, 1,000 troops of Egypt, 10 chariots and 10,000 troops of the land of Irkanatu, 200 troops of Matinu Baal, the city of Arvad, right? And so on and so forth. We can just kind of keep going here. They attacked to wage war and battle against me with the supreme forces which Ashur, my lord, had given to me, and with the mighty weapons with which the divine standard which goes before me had granted me. I fought with them. I defeated them from the city Karkar as far as the city Gilzanu. I felled with the sword 14,000 troops. They're fighting now. All right, this is probably for most of you the first time you've seen an Assyrian royal inscription. Like the Book of Kings, right? This is not something where, okay, this is a purely historical account. This is extremely, there's a point to writing this, and the point is not to kind of have an unbiased recording of history. All right, so looking through this, how does Shalmaneser want to portray himself? Right? If we were to kind of look, and especially at the introduction potentially, how is Shalmaneser portraying himself here?
He was chosen by his God to lead his troops.
Absolutely, right? So Shalmaneser is obviously he's the king of Assyria, but he's not just kind of going and fighting these rebels because he wants to do it and because it's best for him politically. He's going because his God told him he had to do it, right? He got a charge from Ashur, who is the head god of Assyria, right? It's where kind of the land of Assyria gets its name, is this god Ashur. And Ashur, one of the tenets of the god Ashur by this time period is basically that the land of Ashur, the borders of Ashur, have to continuously be enlarged and have to be kept in control by the king. So the king kind of fighting against this rebellion and making sure that these 12 kings who are kind of in cahoots with each other, that they don't overthrow what's happening in Assyria, right? This is a divine prerogative, all right? This should sound like what we're gonna see in other parts of the Book of Kings, right? This idea of kind of the divinity connected to your kingdom, choosing you as the leader and making sure that you do things and then you acting in the correct way towards that divinity, right? That's kind of a key trope that we're gonna see, okay? Great. The other thing to note, and this is a little hard with so many numbers being thrown around, if we just focus in on Ahab here, all right? Ahab sends 10,000 troops and 2,000 chariots, okay? Without having any sort of knowledge of ancient warfare, anything like that, what would you think is more costly, troops or chariots?
Chariots.
Chariots, great, right? Chariots require lots of other resources besides just people to man them. Chariots, right, either had 2 or 3 people manning them for the most part. What's really interesting is out of all of the different people who bring troops and chariots here, Ahab brings the most in terms of chariots. His 2,000 chariots are the most chariots that anybody brings. His troops are also a lot of troops, right? The 10,000 troops are kind of tied for second behind Hadadezer, who's the head of this group. And while we definitely should not take these numbers as history, right? These are big round numbers that I'm sure, right? If you're the Assyrian king, it's in your interest for these numbers to look as big as possible, because then you not only defeated this coalition of 12 kings, but you defeated this coalition of 12 kings that brought thousands upon thousands of troops against you and thousands upon thousands of chariots and so on and so forth. But that being said, the way that scholars have approached this, and there might be some merit to it, is the fact that Ahab kind of brings the most chariots may mean that Ahab, right, had the most chariotry to bring. Whether it was 2,000 or not is not the issue, but it seems like he had more chariots at his disposal than any of these other kings. What does that do, if anything, to our view of Ahab? How does kind of his mention in this inscription with Shalmaneser III and the fact that he brings the most chariots, things like that, how does that change or maybe buttress our view of who Ahab is?
Makes him more powerful militarily.
Great, right? Makes him more powerful militarily. Okay, what else?
What's the matter?
These other kings, that it isn't just little Israel all by itself.
Great, right? And we saw at the beginning of this source right here, right? I think it's source 5. where we have King Ben-Hadad of Aram gathered his whole army with 32 kings accompanied him, and he advanced against Samaria. Right here, it seems like it's kind of 32 kings against Israel, right? 32 against 1. But here we see that Ahab, when he needs to, right, is very, very adept at kind of making his own alliances. And it really shows that Israel is not kind of this singular oddity on the international stage at this point. It functions within the larger international system, right? Which is something that if you just read the Hebrew Bible, sometimes you'll get that, but other times you won't, because understandably, right, the focus is on Israel, the focus is on Judah. And so this kind of changes the focus a little bit, where Ahab is not, right, the first one named, he's not even the second one named, right? He's kind of in the middle of the list. And yes, he has the most chariots that he brought, which tells us that he controlled, maybe had a large military, probably had a lot of resources at his disposal, right? But also shows that he functioned within kind of this larger system that was in the Assyrian purview at the time. Okay, so that's really just what I wanted to take away from there. Any other bits or pieces that people got from this before we move on? Okay, awesome. Okay. So basically what we get from Ahab, right? We, I think, see by looking at not only the Book of Kings, but also at the Assyrian royal inscriptions, we get a view of Ahab that we might miss in Kings, not because it's not there, but because it's overshadowed by the insistence that Ahab is, right, this king who did all these terrible things and made Israel sin and built idols and all these other things, right, that the author of Kings or the authors of Kings are really interested in telling us. We miss the fact that Ahab seems to have been a military, right, was pretty good militarily, seemed to have had a lot of resources, seemed to have controlled a large territory, right, and was a pretty powerful king in his time, which if you just read the Book of Kings, you might end up missing because of the agenda there, okay? We're just gonna look at the next couple of sources quickly, and then we're gonna skip a couple of sources. So who wants to read source 9 for us here?
I'll read, it's Harmon. Yehu sent word throughout Israel, and all the worshippers of Baal came. Not a single one remained behind. They came into the temple of Baal, and the temple of Baal was filled from end to end. When Yehu had finished presenting the burnt offering, he said to the guards and to the officers, "Come in and strike them down, let no man get away." The guards and the officers struck them down with the sword and left them lying where they were. Then they proceeded to the interior of the temple of Baal. They brought out the pillars of the temple of Baal and burned them. They destroyed the pillar of Baal, and they tore down the temple of Baal and turned it into latrines, as is still the case. Thus Yehu eradicated the Baal from Israel. However, Yehu did not turn away from the sinful objects which Jeroboam, son of Nevat, had caused Israel to sin, namely the golden calves at Bethel and at Dan.
Perfect. Thank you so much. All right, so if you had to sum this up, right, just to kind of give people a little historical context, because obviously we're skipping around within the Book of Kings, Yehu is the person who brings Ahab's dynasty, brings the Omeride dynasty to an end. All right, he's the one who kind of becomes king after the Omerides are all killed at Yehu's kind of sword. All right, so how could we sum this up in a couple of words? What happens here?
Yehu defeats the worshippers of Baal, but he does not get rid of the golden calf, the calves that Yeroboam set up in Bethel and Dan.
Absolutely, right? So my kind of pithy summary statement would be Yehu good but not good enough, right? That he goes and he kind of eradicates Baal from Israel, and the author of the Book of Kings thinks that's a great thing. But that being said, he didn't actually go far enough because he didn't get rid of kind of these calves that were set up within the territory of Israel, and that's a big problem for the author of the Book of Kings. So Yehu's good, but he's not really that great. And that's really the view that we get of Jehu in the Book of Kings, right? We also see him as kind of a military leader and this important figure there, okay? We're now gonna move on to another inscription from Shalmaneser III, okay? That king who wrote the inscription that we read previously. This is called the Black Obelisk, and it's called the Black Obelisk because it's a black stele, right? It's about human size or whatever. I was lucky enough to be able to see this in person, and it looks pretty cool in person. But so what we're gonna do, we're just gonna look. There are a couple of kind of images, right? There are a number of different registers on this obelisk. We're gonna look at a couple of different images, and we're gonna look at the caption. So the caption is tribute of Yahuwah, right? That's basically the Assyrian version of Yehu, son of Omri or Humri. I, Shalmaneser III, received silver, gold, a gold bull, a gold taurine, golden vessels, golden pails, tin, and the staffs from the king's hand, and a spear. Okay, so we're gonna just kind of take a look. This is Yehu right here. Yehu is kind of kissing the feet before Shalmaneser III. Okay, this is the king, this is Shalmaneser, this is Yehu. And then these are kind of images of Israel, people who live in the northern kingdom of Israel, Israelites, maybe Israelians, right? It's not really clear what we should be calling them, but right, these are people who live in northern Israel. This is our earliest description or depiction rather of people who live in the northern kingdom of Israel. This is our earliest artistic depiction of them. All right, what do we see from this, right? They have these kind of hats that make them look a little bit like elves, right? Because they're kind of these baggy hats, and they have these shoes with toes that point up, and those make them look like elves also. Okay, what's interesting to note, and the reason why we're kind of going to focus on this just for a second here, is that at this point, the king of Assyria was not really an expert on the northern kingdom of Israel yet, right? Assyria had engaged with the northern kingdom a few times, but it was not a kingdom that they had engaged with over and over for 100 years at this point. And so their depiction of people who came from that northern kingdom, for people who studied the kind of iconography of ancient Mesopotamia, of ancient Assyria, this looks surprisingly or suspiciously similar to other people in the area, right? Just kind of this seems like it's the stereotypical garb for people who come from modern day Syria, northern Israel, right? That kind of area, with this kind of right elf shoe and baggy hat. So we could take it and say, okay, this is what the people who lived in Israel actually wore at that time, or we could say that the artist who depicted this scene maybe wasn't there and maybe didn't see kind of the Israelite king and his followers firsthand, and kind of asked someone and said, all right, well, what do these people look like? Well, they basically look like what everybody else in, that northern part of Israel, southern part of Syria nowadays looks like, right? Where they have kind of these hats on and these shoes, okay? But a fun thing to look at in terms of first depictions of people from the kingdom of Israel. All right. The other thing to focus on here, or to kind of ask ourselves, what do we see in Yehu's name that kind of maybe jumps out at us?
Yeah, he's not the son of Omri.
Right, exactly.
Or at least not according to our sources.
Absolutely, right? So not according to our sources, but in this case, I think it's more safe to rely on the Book of Kings than it is on kind of Shalmaneser's black obelisk. Like I said, and this is kind of another indication of this fact, Shalmaneser and the Assyrians were just coming into contact with Israel, right? They had just come into contact with them for the first time over the past few decades. They're not totally up on what all these different dynasties are in that northern kingdom. And so for them, all right, Omri is kind of the founder of the northern kingdom. And so everybody who is a king of the northern kingdom is described as a son of Omri, even if they're not a son of Omri. And in this case, right, according to the Book of Kings, Yehu is not only not a son of Omri, he is instrumental in making sure that the Omride dynasty is destroyed and is wiped off the map, right? So it's kind of like an interesting little bit here that shows us potentially how little the Assyrians know about the Israelites during that time, or the northern kingdom of Israel during that time.
Zach, where is you said you saw the obelisk. Where is it?
Yes, so the obelisk, I'm almost positive, I could be a little off here, but I'm almost positive that it is in Germany. I think it's in the Pergamum Museum in Germany, in Berlin. The other options, basically anything that we're gonna be reading about here is either in the British Museum in London, the Pergamum Museum in Germany, the National Museum in Turkey, in Ankara or Istanbul actually, and there's some stuff in the Louvre. But the main sources are England, Germany, some France, some Turkey. And that should give us a kind of a good view of who the colonial powers were that dug up this ancient empire after it had collapsed, and 2,500, 3,000 years after these individuals had lived that we're reading about right now. Okay, we're gonna skip over the next couple sources because I wanna get to kind of the main bits and pieces here. We're gonna skip over to Tiglath-Pileser III.
Hey, Zach, may I ask a question?
Please, please.
So what's with the reference to the golden calves?
Great. So the reference to the golden calves, there's a great story where basically when the Northern Kingdom breaks away from the Southern Kingdom, the kings of the Northern Kingdom, at least this is what the Book of Kings tells us, and it's unclear, right, how much of this is true, but this is kind of what the sources tell us. The kings of the Northern Kingdom understand that the temple in Jerusalem is going to be kind of that main draw, and they want some of the income of pilgrims, and they want to make sure that people in the Northern Kingdom of Israel aren't just going back to Judah and going to Jerusalem to pray at the temple there. And so they set up cult sites, right? They set up sites, Dan, which if anyone has been to modern Tel Dan in Israel, right? Kind of up near Kiryat Shmona, up near kind of the Syrian border, right? It's a beautiful, beautiful area, but it's really at the northern border of Israel. And then the second site, I think if I'm not incorrect, is Bethel, is that right? But that's really more in kind of the southern area. Yeah, I'm not even gonna look right there. That's more kind of in the southern area of the Kingdom of Israel. And what these do is these allow people who live in that Northern Kingdom of Israel to worship at these cultic sites within Israel itself, as opposed to going to Jerusalem and worshiping there. This also shows us that in the story of the golden calf that we read, that most of us are probably very familiar with from the Tanakh, from the Torah, right, in the book of Exodus and Shemot, that the idea that they would kind of create a golden calf and that would represent their God is not a coincidence. It seems like that was a known representation of the kind of Northern Israel or Southern Judean God. And that it's, right, it's not, like I said, not a coincidence that that was what was chosen to represent God in the wilderness as well. Does that help?
Yes, for now, that's fine. Good explanation. I mean, short explanation, but appropriate for now.
Okay. All right. So like I said, we have a lot more that we want to cover. I put in way too much, obviously. Let's jump ahead to source number 16. Who wants to read source number 16?
All right, I'll read it, Howard.
Great.
Okay. In the third year of King Hoshea, son of Elah of Israel, Hezekiah, son of King Achaz of Judah, became king. He did what was pleasing to the Lord, just as his father David had done. He abolished the shrines and smashed the pillars and cut down the sacred post. He also broke into pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made, for until that time, the Israelites had been offering sacrifices to it. It was called Nehushtan. He trusted only in the Lord, the God of Israel. There was none like him among the kings of Judah after him, nor among those before him. He clung to the Lord. He did not turn away from following him, but kept the commandments that the Lord had given to Moses. And the Lord was always with him. He was successful wherever he turned. He rebelled against the king of Assyria and would not serve him. He overran Philistia as far as Gaza and its border areas, from watchtower to fortified town.
Perfect, right? This view, this description of Hezekiah, after especially reading the description of Ahab and even the description of Jehu, seems like it was written by somebody totally different, right? Instead of this king did everything was terrible, right? And he led people astray. Hezekiah is the chosen son, right? He's one of two Judean kings who get kind of this heaped on praise, in that basically there was nobody like him and there will never be another after him, right? That he did all these amazing things. His main accomplishments are what we can describe today as kind of cultic reforms. Okay, now what does that mean? Abolish the shrines, smash the pillars, cut down the sacred post. This is something we know that Hezekiah did, and Josiah, who's the other Judean king, who's kind of accorded this hero treatment in the Book of Kings. These are two things that they did where they centralized worship, right? Instead of what happened earlier where if you lived in a town that was maybe a day's or 2 days journey from Jerusalem, you didn't really want to go to Jerusalem to worship. You went and you worshiped at the local sanctuary, right? And you probably had a really close connection to what happened in that local sanctuary. The kings Hezekiah and Josiah tried to change that. They tried to destroy these local sanctuaries and centralize worship. The authors of the Book of Kings really like that, right? They think that that is a great idea. They probably were kind of connected to this centralization effort. And so they really like that Hezekiah did this, right? So Hezekiah is really seen as an amazing king who, right, the Lord God, right, is always with him, was successful everywhere he turned, right? And then we see kind of as an afterthought after we describe his cultic reforms and why the God of Judah loved him so much. He rebelled against Assyria and he wouldn't serve Assyria. He also overran the Philistines. Great, right? Hezekiah is a great king. I'm excited to read what the Book of Kings has said about him. All right, we're going to move on because we, like I said, don't have a huge amount of time. I'm just going to read this part. And this is really the total opposite, right? This is everything hitting the fan, for lack of a better term. All right. In the 14th year of King Hezekiah, King Sennacherib of Assyria marched against all the fortified towns of Judah and seized them. King Hezekiah sent this message to the king of Assyria at Lachish. I have done wrong, withdraw from me, and I shall bear whatever you impose on me. So the king of Assyria imposed upon King Hezekiah of Judah a payment of 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. Hezekiah gave him all the silver that was on hand in the house of the Lord, the temple, and in the treasuries of the palace. At that time, Hezekiah cut down the doors and the doorposts of the temple of the Lord, which Hezekiah had overlaid with gold, and he gave them to the king of Assyria. Right, so kind of in this first paragraph here, Sennacherib comes, doesn't like that Hezekiah has rebelled against him and acts in the same way that the Assyrian king acts to anybody who rebels against him and basically says, you shouldn't have done that. You now need to pay me or else I'm going to destroy all of your territory. And so Hezekiah does that, right? He takes not only what's in the royal palace, he melts down the temples, melts down kind of these doors that were overlaid with gold in the temple of Jerusalem, right? Yahweh's temple, and then gives that off as well. Just keep in our mind here, right, that this is a king who is just described as doing everything that the Lord wanted. So just something to, right, focus on. But the king of Assyria sent the Tartan, the Rabsaris, and the Rabshakeh from Lachish with a large force to King Hezekiah in Jerusalem. They marched up to Jerusalem, and when they arrived, they took up a position. Basically, what happens is the king of Assyria sends up a force and says, I appreciate that you want to give me all of this money to get me to go away, but that's not going to be it, right? We need to settle this. And so he sends up his big military rulers, and they go and they try to talk to Jerusalem, okay? They summon the king and Eliakim, son of Hilkiah, who was in charge of the palace. Shebna the scribe and Yoah the son of Asaph, the recorder, went out to them. The Rabshakeh then said, you tell Hezekiah, thus says the great king, the king of Assyria. What makes you so confident? You must think that mere talk is counsel and valor for war. Look, on whom are you relying and that you have rebelled against me? You rely of all things on Egypt, that splintered reed of a staff, which enters and punctures the palm of anyone who leans on it. That's what Pharaoh, king of Egypt, is like to all who rely on him, right? So this is Hezekiah rebels in the kind of that earlier version that we saw that was the summary statement. Hezekiah can do no wrong. He rebels and everything goes great. We now see here that he rebels based on the backing of the king of Egypt, right? The Pharaoh of Egypt. And it's very clear that Pharaoh does not have a good track record of standing up for his allies, all right? And if you tell me that you're relying on the Lord your God, he is the very one whose shrines and altars Hezekiah did away with, telling Judah and Jerusalem, you must worship only at this altar in Jerusalem. And do you think I have marched against this land to destroy it without the Lord? The Lord himself told me, go up against the land and destroy it, right? It's one of my favorite parts really anywhere in the Tanakh. I would love to teach a whole class on this because I think there's a huge amount going on here. But it's great that, right, the Tanakh really, in this speech that the Tanakh puts, the writers of the Book of Kings put in the mouth of basically this Assyrian general. This speech incorporates the fact, hey, not only are your allies not going to show up and they're no match for the Assyrian king, But if you're relying on your God's actually the one who told me to come here and attack you in the first place. And why did he do that? Because of these cultic reforms that you put in, right? You destroyed all of his local shrines. And I know you think that's a good idea, but it's very clear that he doesn't think that's a good idea, okay? Then we just have to read this kind of first part because this is, once again, a great response. Eliakim, son of Hilkiah, Shebna, and Yoav replied to the Rabshakeh, please speak to your servants in Aramaic. We understand it. Do not speak to us in Judean, right? Meaning Hebrew, in the hearing of the people on the wall, right? But the Rabshakeh says, was it to your master and to you that my master sent me to speak these words? It was precisely to the men who are sitting on the wall, basically people who are guarding the walls and who are gonna have to die in the battle, right? The Rabshakeh, this Assyrian general, goes and he's speaking in Judean, he's speaking in Hebrew, because he doesn't want to get his point across to Hezekiah. He wants to get his point across to the people who live in the city of Jerusalem who are going to have to die if there is a prolonged siege and if there's a war, right? Why is he doing that? He's doing that because he wants to foment some sort of rebellion, right, inside of the city. He wants it so that, right, the people who are sitting on the wall, who are guarding it, are hearing this and kind of saying, maybe, right, we can't rely on the Egyptians. And if Hezekiah had just destroyed all of these altars of our God, maybe we're not in a good spot. Maybe we should listen to the Assyrians here and give in and kind of give the city over to them, okay? That's basically the gist of what's going on here. We're now going to turn to Sennacherib's inscription because this is a time where we have one of the very rare times where we have kind of a very long passage in the book of Kings describing what happens between Sennacherib and Hezekiah. And we have a pretty long royal inscription from Sennacherib that also talks about this, all right? The introduction, Sennacherib, great king, strong king, king of the world, king of Assyria. Once again, the great king and king of Assyria should ring a bell from what we heard in the book of Kings, right? So obviously they understand what the title should be. King of the four quarters of the world, capable shepherd, favorite of the great gods, yada, yada, right? Sennacherib is the greatest. He is, right, strives after good deeds, perfect man, virile warrior, someone who aids the weak, foremost of all rulers, right? Sennacherib's the greatest, all right? To the god Ashur, the great mountain, granted me unrivaled sovereignty, right? Once again, I'm not doing this. I'm not attacking these other kings or kingdoms because I want to. I'm doing that because Ashur told me that I have to do it. And this is kind of how I follow my God's commandments. All right. As for the governors, the nobles, and the people of the city of Ekron, who had thrown Padi, their king, and who was bound by treaty and oaths to Assyria into iron fetters, and who had handed him over to Hezekiah of the land of Judah in a hostile manner, they became frightened on account of the villainous acts that they had committed. They formed a confederation with the kings of Egypt. Okay, we've heard that before. And the archers, chariots, and horses of the kings of the land of Melucha. Melucha is basically Sudan, basically southern parts of Egypt now. Forces without number, and they came to their aid. I surrounded, conquered, and plundered the cities of El-Teka and Tamna. I approached the city of Ekron, killed the governor and the nobles who committed the crimes, and basically, hung their corpses on the wall, did these terrible things to basically show everyone this is what happens if you mess with the king of Assyria. I counted the citizens who had committed the criminal acts as booty. I commanded the rest of them, those who were not guilty of crimes or wrongdoing, to whom no penalty was due, to be allowed to go free. We're just going to pause here for a second, right? In this royal inscription, we have Sennacherib drawing a picture of this terrible confederation of Philistine rulers, right? People of the city of Ekron who kind of rebelled against their own ruler with the help of Hezekiah of Judah and potentially with the help of the Egyptians, that all these people rebel, but they kind of, right, they seem to have a moment of clarity, if you will, and they become frightened because they understand that what they did was so terrible, right? And that the Assyrian king is going to come after them for that. We then have the Assyrian king describing in some really unsavory terms what he does to the people who are guilty. But for the people that aren't guilty, right, those people are allowed to go free. Once again, Sennacherib is this just ruler who's not just going to punish everybody equally. He's going to kind of separate who he punishes, all right? Brought out Padi, their king, from the city of Jerusalem and placed him on the lordly throne over them. That I imposed upon him payment and recognition of my overlordship. As for Hezekiah, the land of Judah, who had not submitted to my yoke, I surrounded and conquered 46 of his fortified cities, basically, right, destroying them, brought out of them 200,000 people, young and old, female, male, horses, mules, donkeys, so on and so forth, and I counted them as booty. As for Hezekiah, I confined him inside the city of Jerusalem, his royal city, like a bird in a cage. I set up blockades against him and made him dread exiting his city gate. I detached from his land and the cities of his land that I had plundered and gave them to the king of the city of Ashdod and Padi, who's the king of the city of Ekron, making his land smaller. All right. Basically, right, we then have Hezekiah, the fear of my lordly brilliance overwhelmed him. After my departure, he basically sends all of these people with gold, silver, all these great things, right? Ivory, elephant hides, boxwood, to the king of Assyria, and basically said, hey, I'm sorry, I rebelled against you. All right. And so what's interesting to me is not that, hey, everything that the book of Kings shows is correct and everything that we see from the Assyrian kings is incorrect. It's interesting to see where they intersect, right? So it's very clear that Hezekiah is a key player in a rebellion by the Philistine kings who kind of control this coastal area, that it includes the king of Egypt, okay? And that Hezekiah is a key player here. Hezekiah also, it seems like after he rebelled, the Assyrian king basically beats them in battle. Maybe the Egyptians don't show up the way that they should. And because of that, Hezekiah seems to lose faith, right? Sennacherib besieges him in his city of Jerusalem. We saw that in the Tanakh, and we saw that in this right here. What's really interesting, though, is that the Assyrian royal inscription, right, if this was a royal inscription where the writers could just kind of make up whatever they wanted, this would go the way that basically every other inscription does, where after the Assyrian king goes and besieges something, he conquers it. Right? There's no idea that he besieges it and then he just leaves because he wants to. He conquers it, he destroys it, whatever. That's not what happens here. And that's not what happens in the Tanakh either, right? In the Tanakh, right, the God of Judah saves Hezekiah and Jerusalem. Here, the Assyrian king kind of loses interest and gets his the payment back that he wanted, and so he leaves. What's really interesting is that right, the Assyrian king here is also kind of covering up potentially for this idea of I wanted to be able to destroy Jerusalem. I surrounded Jerusalem and kind of put on, right, this squeeze so that Hezekiah was like a bird in a cage, and I wanted to destroy it, but I couldn't do that. And what we have here is we have a wall carving from the palace of Sennacherib, right? These are kind of Assyrian archers. It's kind of hard to see. Assyrian archers going up shooting, and they're shooting at like a really hard angle. And we have siege engines, right? These are things that are supposed to break walls down that are also going up. This is the siege of the city of Lachish. The reason why it's the siege of the city of Lachish and not the city of Jerusalem is because Jerusalem doesn't fall, right? Jerusalem is not conquered. So Lachish is conquered. We get from the Tanakh that Lachish is conquered. We know that if you're the king of Assyria, you don't really care if a secondary center is conquered. You want the royal city to be conquered. So people have speculated, but I think not necessarily incorrectly, that originally this kind of depiction of a siege in Judah was supposed to be meant for Jerusalem, but that didn't quite work out. All right. Last little bit that I'm going to show you is depictions of Judeans. Right? This is about 100 years later, also in Assyria. So the Assyrians had now have interactions with Judeans and Israelites for, let's say, about 150 years at this point, right? They have had a long history of interactions. So they have a much better view of kind of what they look at, right? What they look like. The funny little hats are gone, right? These people are barefoot and hatless, probably because they're bound and kind of they're going to be taken into captivity. But here we get a better view. This guy, right, he has a hat, but his hat's totally different, right? His hat kind of has these ear flaps. It's not kind of this, elf-like hat that we saw before. And the shoes, if we could see them, the shoes would not be kind of these upturned elf-looking shoes, right? So the view of the Judean is much more in focus here. And this picture of the Judean going into captivity is what we're going to be focusing on in the next session, right? What Judah looks like, not after this captivity, because this is not kind of the final captivity, right? This is some people being sent into captivity basically 125 years before the temple's destroyed. What we're going to be looking at is after the temple's destroyed and we get people sent into captivity in Babylonia. What does that look like? All right, I hope you all enjoyed the class. Thank you so much. Please, please, please join next week, same time, same place. And I look forward to it.
Okay, thanks, Zach. That was great.
Thank you, Zach.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was terrific.
Have a good night, everyone.
You too.
Bye.
Thank you. It was great, Zach.
Thank-
Enjoyed it
Thanks
very
a lot,
much.
Zach. Take care.
Thank you.
Shakar.